No one had ever seen a room like this lose control. The private surgical wing was sealed, guarded, untouchable, yet it was unraveling in real time. Heart monitors screamed. Oxygen levels collapsed for the third time in 10 minutes. White coats crowded the bassinet, hands moving faster as certainty disappeared. These weren't ordinary physicians. They were flown in, bought at any price, specialists who usually arrived after the headlines were written, not before a life slipped away, and still, they had nothing. Cassius Genovese stood at the center of it all, unmoving. Black coat, gold chains. A man who ruled through fear, who ended wars with phone calls, now helpless as his newborn daughter, Rosa, faded in front of him. Her lips had begun to discolor. Her tiny chest struggled between breaths. Every test came back clean. Every treatment failed. Someone whispered intervention. Someone else said now. They kept searching inside her body because they couldn't imagine the danger came from something small, cheap, and already dismissed. Near the sink, unnoticed, stood a child who didn't belong in that room. Eli Brooks was 8 years old. Too thin, too quiet. A boy shaped by corners and waiting. He had learned early that rooms like this weren't meant for kids like him. So he watched instead. Always watched. People who are never seen learn how to notice everything. His eyes tracked the baby. The shallow breathing. The discoloration spreading where it shouldn't. The way the doctors argued diagnoses while missing what was right in front of them. Eli's chest tightened. He'd seen this before. Not in hospitals, in abandoned buildings, in makeshift baths, in newborns washed with water that looked clean. Until it wasn't. If this story already has your attention, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. These moments travel farther than you think. Eli stepped forward, tried to speak. His voice didn't reach anyone. It never did. Behind him, armed guards shifted their weight. In front of him, the doctors prepared a final procedure, one that would end Rosa's life. They didn't know it yet. They were about to make a fatal mistake. Eli looked at the sink, then at the baby, then at the men who would kill him if he was wrong. What he was about to do couldn't be undone, and if he was wrong, Rosa wouldn't survive the next minute. Before you see what Eli does, hit like if you believe courage doesn't need permission. Alarms erupted. A guard shouted. Cassius turned just in time to see a small boy lift his daughter from the bassinet and run. Eli didn't think about punishment, or permission, or consequences. He only knew this. The people with power were out of answers, and the truth was in his hands. What do you do when the world's most powerful men are helpless, and the only person who knows how to save a life is the one no one ever sees? Eli Brooks didn't belong in that room, but he was the only one who could save her. If stories like this keep you watching past the point you meant to stop, subscribe, because the next one starts exactly where power fails. Cassius Genovese had built his life on a simple truth. Nothing touched him unless he allowed it. He had walked through gunfire without flinching, sat across tables where men begged for mercy and decided their fate between sips of espresso. Judges bent, politicians called late at night, hospitals cleared entire floors when his name appeared on an intake form. Power followed him the way shadows follow light, quiet, constant, unquestioned. Until tonight. The surgical wing belonged to him in every way that mattered. Armed men at every entrance, doctors who didn't ask about payment because it had already been handled, equipment flown in ahead of him, silence purchased at a premium. Yet standing beside the bassinet, Cassius felt something he hadn't felt since childhood. Helplessness. Rosa was impossibly small, wrapped in sterile white, her fingers curled like they were holding on to something only she could feel. Cassius leaned closer, his breath catching when her chest stuttered between shallow breaths. The machines spoke for her now, sharp beeps, rising alarms, numbers sliding in the wrong direction. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. No one answered him directly. The doctors spoke to each other instead. Acronyms, possibilities, procedures layered on top of uncertainty. They sounded confident because that was what they were trained to sound like when they were afraid. Cassius heard it immediately. Fear disguised as authority. He hated it. He stepped forward and the room reacted on instinct. Doctors shifted. A guard moved half a step closer. Cassius noticed all of it. He always did. But none of it mattered when the lead physician finally turned and said the words Cassius had never heard in his life. "We don't know why this is happening." Cassius felt the ground tilt, not beneath his feet, but inside his chest. The sensation was unfamiliar, disorienting. He had built empires on knowing, on information, on certainty. And now 25 experts were telling him knowledge had failed. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that my daughter is dying, and you don't know why." Silence answered him. Cassius looked down at Rosa again. He reached out, hesitated, then let his finger brush against her tiny hand. It closed weakly around him. The contact sent a shock through his body far more violent than any bullet ever had. He would burn cities for her, break every rule he had ever followed. Yet none of that mattered here. Violence couldn't threaten oxygen into her lungs. Money couldn't buy answers that didn't exist. The monitors spiked again. A nurse called out numbers. Someone said, "Intervention." Cassius straightened, rage coiling hot and instinctive. This was the moment men usually feared him, the moment when rooms bent to his will. But the doctors didn't look at him for permission. They looked at the clock. For the first time in his life, Cassius Genovese understood the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't an enemy with a gun. It was time moving forward without his consent. And somewhere near the edge of the room, unseen and unimportant, a small boy watched as the untouchable man realized power meant nothing at all. Eli Brooks knew which floors stayed warm at night. The stairwell between pediatrics and surgical recovery held heat longer than the rest of the hospital, trapped by pipes that hummed softly after midnight. He slept there when security rotations changed, curled tight with his jacket pulled over his ears, waking before dawn so no one could say they'd seen him. Being seen led to questions. Questions led to removal. Removal led back to the streets. So Eli learned the margins. He learned which vending machines jammed and dropped food, if you hit them just right. Which bathrooms were cleaned last and stayed unlocked longest. Which nurses left half-drunk cups of juice at the desk when alarms pulled them away. Survival wasn't luck. It was attention. He had been coming to this hospital since before he could spell its name. His mother cleaned here once. Night shifts, quiet shifts, the kind where no one asked questions as long as the floors shined and the trash disappeared. She taught him to sit still, to wait, to listen. "People talk loud when they think nobody matters enough to hear," she'd said. Then she got sick. Then she was gone. The hospital never noticed. Eli stayed. During the day, he blended into hallways and waiting rooms. During the night, he watched. He watched doctors argue and nurses move with practiced calm. He watched machines breathe for people who couldn't. He learned patterns without trying. Which symptoms came before which alarms, which babies cried differently when something was wrong. No one taught him this. No one meant to. That was the thing about being invisible. You saw everything. When Rosa arrived, the hospital changed. Floors cleared, guards doubled. Men in dark suits stood where volunteers usually smiled. Eli noticed immediately. Power always announced itself by pushing others out of the way. He saw the baby only once at first, through glass. Too still, too quiet. Eli's stomach tightened, the same way it had when he'd seen babies in places no baby should be, wrapped in towels, bathed in water scooped from rusted pipes because there was no other choice. He told himself it wasn't his business. That was the rule. Stay out of rooms that don't belong to you. Don't draw lines toward yourself. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't exist loudly. But as the hours passed, Eli found himself drifting closer, lingering, watching doctors come and go with faces that didn't relax when they should have, listening to tones shift from confidence to urgency, noticing the same details he always noticed, the way Rosa's skin changed, the way her breathing didn't match the machines helping her. Eli stood near the sink because no one stood there, because it was the safest place to be invisible. When the alarms spiked again, something in him settled instead of panicked. A quiet certainty replaced fear. He'd seen this before. Not here. Not like this. But enough to know the truth didn't live where they were looking. Eli swallowed hard. He knew what staying silent meant. He also knew what it would cost to speak. And for the first time since he learned how to disappear, Eli Brooks considered stepping fully into view. They arrived in waves. Private elevators opened and closed with practiced urgency, releasing men and women whose names carried weight far beyond this building. Coats still creased from long flights, shoes polished too carefully for a hospital floor. Some wore badges from institutions that usually appeared at the end of medical textbooks, not in emergency corridors at midnight. 25 experts, each one introduced with a specialty, a reputation, a quiet confidence that suggested this was simply another problem waiting to be solved. They took over the room without asking. Charts were lifted, screens were turned, instructions were given in clipped tones that didn't invite disagreement. Someone ordered more blood work. Someone else dismissed it before the vial was even drawn. The language changed. Technical, fast, layered with certainty. Acronyms filled the air like armor. Eli watched from the edge as they circled Rosa. They checked her heart, her lungs, her brain. They debated genetics, infection, rare syndromes that carried names long and impressive enough to sound convincing. Every theory arrived with authority and left in pieces when the numbers refused to cooperate. Machines hummed louder, as if trying to compensate for what the humans couldn't figure out. Cassius stood just outside the circle they formed, close enough to hear everything, too far to touch his daughter. Power followed him everywhere else in the world, but here it stalled at the threshold of expertise. He said little. He didn't need to. The tension in his silence spoke louder than threats. The doctors felt it. Eli could tell. Their confidence frayed as minutes passed. Voices rose, shoulders stiffened. One specialist glanced at another before speaking, searching for confirmation that didn't come. They kept searching inside Rosa's body. More scans, more tests, because that was where answers were supposed to live. Failure didn't fit their training. A neonatologist suggested waiting. A cardiologist disagreed. A neurologist shook his head and pointed at a monitor that refused to stabilize. Each of them was brilliant. Each of them was wrong. Eli noticed what they didn't. How Rosa's breathing didn't match the rhythm of the ventilator. How her skin reacted unevenly, not like illness, but like exposure. How the doctors avoided looking at the simplest things in the room, their eyes trained upward toward screens instead of downward toward details. They walked past the sink again, and again. Eli counted without meaning to. 17 times. The room grew crowded with knowledge and thin on understanding. Pride filled the gaps where certainty had been. No one wanted to be the first to admit they didn't know. Admitting that meant stepping down from the pedestal that had carried them this far. "Prepare for intervention," someone finally said. The word landed hard. Cassius straightened. Guards shifted. A nurse reached for gloves with hands that trembled despite her training. Eli's heart began to race, not with fear, but recognition. He'd seen what happened when adults pushed forward instead of stopping to look. He'd seen what confidence did when it ignored the quiet signs. 25 experts stood in that room, armed with credentials, titles, and machines worth more than most lives. And none of them realized they were about to make the worst mistake of their careers. Eli's mind went quiet, the way it always did when something finally made sense. The room was loud, voices overlapping, machines pulsing. shoes scuffing against polished floors, but inside him, everything aligned. He wasn't guessing anymore. He was remembering. He remembered the basement under the old rail bridge where families washed babies using water collected in plastic containers because it was all they had. He remembered the smell. Metallic, sharp, not quite right. He remembered the way newborns cried differently afterward. Not loud, not weak, confused, like their bodies didn't know what was happening to them. Rosa was breathing the same way. Shallow, irregular, fighting something that wasn't supposed to be inside her. Eli watched the monitor spike and fall again. The doctors kept naming things that lived deep in the body. Organs, systems, defects you were born with. They kept searching inward because that's where they were trained to look. But this wasn't coming from inside Rosa. It was on her, or rather, it had passed through her. Eli noticed how the rash spread unevenly, how it followed lines instead of patterns. He noticed how her skin reacted faster than her blood work suggested it should. He noticed how washing her earlier had calmed her breathing for just a moment before the symptoms returned stronger. Water could do that. Not clean water, but water that looked clean enough to trust. He remembered the warnings whispered in shelters. Don't use the tap after it rains. Don't bathe the babies there. Boil it first. If you can. He remembered watching mothers cry as symptoms appeared hours later, long after the water was gone. Poison didn't always arrive in bottles with labels. Sometimes it came through pipes no one checked anymore. Eli's eyes drifted to the sink. It sat there, ordinary and overlooked, stainless steel gleaming under harsh lights. He imagined the water rushing, imagined what it could wash away, and what it could make worse if it wasn't done right. The doctors walked past it again, chasing answers buried in charts and screens. None of them looked down. None of them thought backward. Eli's chest tightened. He knew why they were wrong now. They weren't failing because they lacked knowledge. They were failing because they couldn't imagine a cause that didn't come from authority, technology, or complexity. They couldn't imagine that something cheap and invisible had slipped through the cracks and landed here, in the arms of a man powerful enough to frighten cities. Eli tried to speak again. His mouth opened. The words caught in his throat. He wasn't supposed to know things like this. A nurse brushed past him without seeing him. A guard shifted closer to Cassius. The doctors prepared instruments that would open Rosa's body in search of an enemy that wasn't there. Eli swallowed. If he stayed silent, Rosa would die. If he spoke, and he was wrong, so would he in a different way. The pattern was clear now, as clear as it had ever been. And for the first time since he learned how to survive by disappearing, Eli Brooks understood that being invisible was no longer an option. Silence had always kept Eli alive. It was the first rule he learned and the hardest one to unlearn. Stay quiet, stay out of sight. Let the world pass you by without noticing you exist. Silence meant warmth at night, a place to sleep, another day without being pushed back onto the streets. Right now, silence wrapped around him like armor. He stood near the wall, small enough to be ignored, watching men with power and guns argue over a baby's life. His hands curled into his sleeves, fingers pressing into the frayed fabric as if he could disappear inside it. No one had asked his name. No one had asked what he'd seen. That was normal. Expected. Safe. Eli's eyes drifted back to Rosa. Her chest fluttered, each breath thinner than the last. The alarms didn't scream yet. They hovered, warning, like they were deciding whether to give up on her. He felt the familiar pull in his chest, the instinct to step back, to let adults handle adult things. That instinct had saved him before. But another memory pushed forward, sharp and unwelcome. A woman in a shelter, shaking a baby who wouldn't stop crying. A nurse too tired to listen. A warning spoken too late. Eli remembered standing still then, too, afraid of saying the wrong thing, afraid of being noticed. That baby didn't make it. The doctors moved with renewed urgency. Instruments were laid out. Gloves snapped into place. Words like necessary and inevitable floated through the room. They spoke with the confidence of people who believed authority protected them from consequences. Eli felt his heart pound harder, not with panic, but with certainty. He knew what was wrong. He knew what needed to be done. Knowing didn't make it easier. If he spoke now, guards would grab him. He'd be dragged out, maybe arrested, maybe worse. Cassius Genovese didn't look like a man who forgave mistakes, especially ones involving his child. Eli imagined the moment his voice cut through the room, the way heads would turn, the way disbelief would harden into anger, the way silence would no longer protect him. He imagined staying quiet instead. Rosa's breathing hitched again. Eli's throat burned. His mother's voice echoed in his head, soft and tired. "Don't give them a reason, Eli. Just stay invisible." He took a step back. Then another. Each step felt heavier than the last, like he was walking away from something he wouldn't be able to return to. The alarms edged closer to screaming. Time tightened its grip. Eli stopped. Silence might keep him alive, but it would kill her. The thought landed with a weight that crushed every excuse he had left. Survival didn't mean much if it came at the cost of watching another life slip away when he knew how to stop it. Eli drew a shaky breath. He straightened his shoulders, and for the first time in his life, he chose to be heard. Eli moved before fear could catch him. One moment he was standing against the wall, small and forgettable. The next, he was stepping forward, cutting through the space the doctors had claimed as theirs. His voice never came. There was no warning, no plea, only motion. Hands reached out too late. Eli lifted Rosa from the bassinet with a care that surprised even him. She was lighter than he expected, warmer than the sterile room, her tiny body trembling against his chest. For a split second, the world seemed to freeze. 25 experts, armed guards, a Mafia boss mid-turn, each of them trying to understand what they were seeing. Then the alarms erupted. A sharp, piercing sound tore through the room as monitors registered sudden change. Someone shouted. A chair scraped back. A guard's hand went to his weapon on instinct, training overriding reason. "Hey! Stop him! Put the baby down!" Eli didn't look back. He ran. His shoes slipped on the polished floor as he sprinted toward the sink, Rosa clutched tight against him. The room exploded into motion behind him, white coats scattering, guards breaking formation, voices stacking on top of one another in rising panic. Cassius Genovese moved faster than anyone thought possible. "Don't!" he roared, the word ripping out of him as he saw the boy veer toward the sink instead of the exit. A gun cleared its holster. Another followed. The click of metal echoed louder than the alarms. Eli reached the sink and turned the tap with shaking hands. Water surged out, loud and relentless. He didn't hesitate. He positioned Rosa beneath the stream, careful, precise, letting the water flow over her skin the way he'd seen before, washing, flushing, stripping away what didn't belong. Hands grabbed at him. A guard slammed into Eli's shoulder, sending pain up his arm, but he didn't let go. Another tried to pull Rosa back, shouting orders that blurred into noise. Eli braced himself against the sink, shielding her with his body, refusing to release his grip. "Get him off her! He's killing her! Shoot him!" The word shoot sliced through everything. Cassius stood frozen, gun raised, eyes locked on the scene unfolding in front of him. His daughter, a child, water rushing, chaos swallowing reason. Eli screamed then, not words, just sound, raw and desperate, pouring everything he had into holding on. He felt hands pin him, felt himself forced down, felt the cold floor against his knees. But the water kept running. And in the midst of shouting, sirens, and drawn weapons, something changed. The alarms shifted, not louder, not worse, different. A nurse froze mid-movement. A doctor stared at the monitor, disbelief spreading across his face. "Wait," someone whispered. The room faltered, suspended between violence and revelation, as 25 experts stared at proof they hadn't believed possible, and a small boy lay on the floor, still holding on, as if letting go now might undo everything. Water thundered into the basin, loud enough to drown out reason. Eli knelt on the floor, pinned by weight and shouting, his arms wrapped around Rosa as if letting go would shatter her. The stream rushed over her skin in steady sheets, cold and relentless, splashing against stainless steel and flooding the room with sound. Someone tried to shut the tap off. Eli twisted his body, shielding the handle with his elbow, crying out as a hand wrenched at his shoulder. "Stop him! He doesn't know what he's doing! Get the baby away from the water!" Their voices collided, panicked and sharp, filling every corner of the room. Guards barked orders over one another. Doctors argued in bursts of disbelief. The word protocol was shouted like it could rewind time. Cassius Genovese stood frozen, gun still raised, eyes locked on the sink. Rosa whimpered, a thin, fragile sound, but she didn't cry the way she had before. Eli noticed that first, not because he was calm, but because he was listening in the only way he knew how. He adjusted the angle, letting the water run across her back and arms, careful not to shock her, careful not to stop. His hands moved with instinct, sharpened by memory. He'd seen this exact moment before, the waiting, the doubt, the fear that came just before it worked. A doctor lunged forward. Eli felt fingers claw at his wrist, felt his grip slipping. He clenched his teeth and held on harder, pressing Rosa closer to the stream. "Look at the monitor!" someone yelled. The room hesitated. Just for a second. The alarms faltered, not silenced, but softened. The sharp edge dulled. The pitch changed. A nurse stared at the screen, her breath catching in her throat. That's not possible," she whispered. Rosa's breathing evened, just slightly. Not fixed, not safe, but no longer spiraling. Color crept back into her lips, faint but undeniable. The screaming stopped. One by one, voices fell away as eyes turned toward the monitors. 25 experts stood still, watching numbers stabilize in real time. No theory, no debate, just evidence unfolding in front of them. Cassius lowered the gun without realizing he'd done it. The water kept running. Eli stayed exactly where he was, terrified that stopping now would undo everything. His arms shook with exhaustion, his knees burned against the floor. He didn't care. He couldn't care. All that mattered was the fragile weight in his hands and the rhythm of Rosa's breath matching the sound of rushing water. A doctor stepped closer, slower this time. "Don't turn it off," he said quietly. "Not yet." No one argued. The sink, ordinary, ignored, stainless steel, had become the center of the room, the place where certainty collapsed, where authority had been stripped away by something simple and unstoppable. And in the middle of it all, a small boy knelt on the floor, holding a Mafia boss's daughter under running water, as the world realized it had been wrong. The monitors told the story before anyone dared to speak. The jagged lines that had ruled the room softened, their frantic spikes easing into steadier rhythms. Numbers that had been sliding toward catastrophe hesitated, then climbed. Oxygen levels stabilized. Heart rate slowed, not perfectly, but enough to pull the room back from the edge. A nurse blinked, then checked again, fingers moving faster now, not with panic but disbelief. "It's holding," she said. No one answered her. 25 experts stood in stunned silence, eyes fixed on the screens as if the data might vanish if they looked away. Years of training told them this shouldn't be happening. Not like this, not from water, not from a child kneeling on the floor. But the evidence didn't care what they believed. A doctor stepped closer to the sink, his voice stripped of authority. The symptoms. They're flushing, he murmured, piecing it together out loud. External exposure, not systemic failure. We missed it. The words landed hard. They had been wrong. Not almost. Completely. Eli stayed where he was, arms trembling, still holding Rosa beneath the steady stream. He barely heard them now. His focus was locked on her breathing, stronger than before, more regular. She stirred slightly, a tiny movement that sent a wave of relief through him, so intense it nearly knocked the breath from his chest. Cassius Genovese hadn't moved. He stood a few steps back, staring at the sink as if it were something sacred and dangerous all at once. The gun hung useless at his side. His hands shook, not with rage, but with something far worse. Relief, the kind that cracked something open inside him. He took one step forward, then another. The guards didn't stop him. No one did. Power had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. Cassius knelt. The sound of it, fabric against tile, felt louder than the alarms had been. A man who had never bowed to anyone lowered himself to the floor beside a child he hadn't seen until moments ago. His breath came uneven, his jaw tight as if holding back something that didn't belong to him anymore. "My daughter," he whispered, voice breaking on the word. She's stabilizing," a doctor said quickly. "We need to continue monitoring, but she's out of immediate danger." Cassius closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet. He looked at Eli, not with suspicion, not with anger, but with awe so raw it hurt to witness. A boy in a frayed jacket, barely holding himself upright, the one person in the room who had acted when everyone else froze. "You saved her," Cassius said quietly. Eli didn't answer. He didn't know how. Around them, the room slowly exhaled. Authority rearranged itself. Pride fell away. The truth settled in, heavy and undeniable. Rosa lived, and nothing in that room would ever be the same again. The hospital returned to its routines long before Cassius Genovese did. Machines were powered down. Floors were cleaned. Guards resumed their posts. By morning, the surgical wing looked the way it always had. Sterile, efficient, forgettable. But something had shifted beneath the surface, something no renovation could fully erase. Rosa slept peacefully now, wrapped in soft blankets instead of wires. Her breathing was steady, her color warm. Cassius stood beside her crib for hours without speaking, one hand resting lightly against the glass, as if afraid to touch her again. Every rise of her chest felt like a gift he hadn't earned. Across the room, Eli sat quietly, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Someone had given him clean clothes. Someone else had offered food. He accepted both with careful politeness, still unsure whether kindness was permanent or temporary. Cassius watched him the way men like him rarely watched anyone, with attention. In the days that followed, questions came, investigations, quiet meetings behind closed doors. The truth emerged piece by piece: contaminated water lines, overlooked maintenance reports, assumptions left unchallenged because they came from places no one important ever visited. The doctors documented everything. The hospital board listened more closely than they ever had before. Cassius made sure of that. The wing was shut down for reconstruction. Pipes replaced, protocols rewritten, new safeguards put in place, ones that didn't rely solely on machines or prestige. He funded it all without negotiation, not as charity, as penance. Eli was called into an office he'd never imagined sitting in. Sunlight streamed through glass walls. Cassius stood when the boy entered, an instinct that surprised everyone in the room. "You shouldn't have had to make that choice," Cassius said, voice steady but changed. "But because you did, your life doesn't go back to the margins." Arrangements were made quickly: education, tutors, a place to live that didn't involve stairwells or shadows, not favors, commitments. Cassius insisted on that distinction. Eli listened quietly, nodding when appropriate, still unsure how to exist in a world that suddenly saw him. When it was over, he asked only one question. "Is she okay?" Cassius answered without hesitation. "She will be." Years later, people would tell different versions of what happened that night. Some softened it, some exaggerated it. Cassius never corrected them. He didn't need the story to be comfortable. He carried it with him instead. The image returned to him often. A small boy kneeling on a cold floor, holding his daughter under running water while the world screamed. A reminder that all the power he'd accumulated hadn't saved Rosa, but a child who refused to stay invisible did. And that was something Cassius Genovese would never forget.